All right, everyone. I'm Chris Campbell with the Food Institute, and welcome to our webinar introducing the Snack 50, the industry's first psych-based measurement of the world's top snack brands. The Food Institute is the best single source for food industry news, data, and trends. And to learn more about the Food Institute, please visit www.foodinstitute.com and please sign up for our free newsletters to stay up to date on all of our great content. We are delighted to present this webinar in partnership with Alpha Diver. Alpha Diver is the Cincinnati-based market research consultancy that applies neuroscience to more deeply understand marketplace behavior. Since 2011, they've guided brands and retailers to double-digit growth results via strategy and activation. And you can learn more about Alpha Diver at www.alpha-diver.com. At this point, I'd like to take care of a little housekeeping. Yes, you will receive a recording of this webinar, and yes, you will receive the slide deck. Just give us a few days for processing on that end. If you look to the top of your chat screen, you'll see a Q&A tab as well. Please submit any questions you may have in this section, as we'll be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And with that said, I'll hand it over to Food Institute CEO Brian Choi to introduce today's guests. So over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Chris. Just to introduce our presenter today, Hunter Thurman is the president of Alpha Diver. In 2011, Hunter started Alpha Diver with the vision of applying behavioral science to more deeply understand marketplace behavior. He gathered leading minds in the worlds of neuroscience and psychology and quickly discovered the wealth of insight that was sitting untapped within academia. He and his team built the framework of durable, predictable human truths, specifically the 4 drivers and 5 barriers that underline behavior. The Alpha Diver team works with the world's leading brands and the Wall Street analyst community to continually explain, measure, and predict consumer behavior. And just before we get started, I want to provide some context about the genesis of the Snack 50. It really started with a discussion that Hunter and I had about 6 months ago. What we've been noticing is that there are a lot of rankings out there on CPG brands, and they really don't provide a robust methodology. A lot of them are biased. They're based on popularity polls, black box, based on subjective analyses by consultants. Some are pay to play. And therefore, they provide little value in helping management teams understand the key variables of brand strength. And so this Snack 50 is the start of a new robust methodology that Hunter and his team have developed. We're super excited to present it. There's a lot more to come. So please stay tuned for phase 2, phase 3. And without further ado, here's Hunter Thurman of Alpha Diver. Hunter, take it away.
Thanks, Brian and Chris. Yeah, great to be here. And just one more note. You see, there's the public chat over on the side, and I see people are putting in locations. Great to see everybody. Feel free to start adding questions as we go. I'm going to take you through this, obviously. May field a couple things as we go, but more than likely we'll wait till the end. But happy to have a lot of dialogue, and I'm certainly going to leave time here for Q&A and to hopefully have some good conversation with everybody. So, okay, this may be a little bit of a cruel webinar to have at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And you see some of these products, these various snacks arrayed across your screen. And, it's probably going to, maybe an hour from now, by the end of this webinar, they're going to start to sound pretty good. The Wall Street Journal had an article just yesterday about the proliferation of snacking as a category, and named, I think, virtually all the manufacturers and brands that are in this report, and cited the double-digit growth. I think it was 11% growth across snacks year over year, just continuous increase in growth. And this is U.S. data that we're going to talk about today. Americans, just can't seem to get enough of snacking brands. But what we want to talk about is, why do they choose one over the other? Why are people choosing something to consume? Why are these creating these places in our emotions and in our behavior? And as Brian said, simply looking at sales volume or looking at growth or CAGRs or conventional metrics, they really don't tell the story. They don't tell the why. So what we endeavored to do, and what you're going to see here, as Chris and Brian have set up, is the industry's first measure of the psychological drivers of real-world consumer behavior. So we know that so much consumption, so much of behavior happens subconsciously. That happens between the ears. We humans and our consumers that we're trying to serve are constantly making decisions, whether they're far afield of a snack preparing to enjoy one, opening their cabinet, looking in their handbag, or actually, on a retail website or in a brick and mortar store making decisions. There are tons of these microtransactions happening in people's mind. Well, what drives those? How can we understand those? How can we use them in a more potent and disciplined way? So that's what brings us to this list, this platform that we're calling the Snack 50. So it's about the whys behind brand performance. I'm going to talk about things like consumer affinity, usage momentum, and the paths that this opens up. So, knowing where you are on the list and why you're there is the first step. The go-dos, as we in marketing circles talk about it, are really what's most important, the so whats. So the Snack 50 is based on this measure I'm going to describe that we call the Psych Pulse. Which is this very unique brand strength measure that obviously we have pioneered and curate here at Alpha Diver and do a great deal of work in partnership with the Food Institute. So I talked about the first measure of psychological drivers, and what you're going to see in this list, this top 50 list, is that each brand is ranked by a unique composite score, this Psych Pulse score. And really think of these as the 3 ingredients to the behavioral recipe. There are 3 factors that underlie human behavior. The first is this most kind of obvious one of the behavior. But what we're looking at is not just do you eat it, regular scanner data and receipt tracking, data and things like that can tell you whether they're eating it. What we're studying is how habituated is it? How important, how much a part of their life, how routinized is consumption? So that's the first score. That's combined with then what we call psychological attachment. That's really emotion. How hard would it be for them to give up? How attached and enthusiastic are they to the brand? And that obviously is a very potent element of brand health. And then the third that everybody's always interested in is trajectory, or what we call usage momentum. Is it a brand that's taking off? Is it a brand that is going to remain flat, or is it a brand that better be looking to some changes, some shifts to make sure it doesn't start to decline? And so with those, you see that kind of check mark in the middle. This aggregate score not only rates and ranks these. I'm going to show you a ranking in a moment. But then what I'm going to get into is the why. Why are they performing in those ways, and what might be the challenges or the opportunities ahead? This is administered and designed by our research team here, which is headed by, you see a picture there at the bottom, our principal neuroscientist and director of research, Siggy Hale, PhD, who is the arbiter of all these measures, these durable drivers, and the ways that we go out to market and measure and database them. One question that I think we'll get is how we got, how do we get to these 50? So you're going to see 50 brands across 12 different subcategories of snacking, and they're based loosely on performance. So these are certainly the top selling snack brands. We've added in a few here and there that may be just out of the top 50 of like sales volume to make sure that we had enough entrants from a given category, a smaller category. And you'll see that we've added 8 what I would call owned brands or store brands, many still calling them private labels, because it's a really important piece of the story. And it's something that in lists like this is often overlooked. All we care about is brands, store brands are merely a trade down. You're going to see that that's not the case. And that's why we were very deliberate in including them in this measure. Okay. So now the list. And you'll see we've got them grouped in groups of 10 here. So the number one across that trifecta of psychological impact is Reese's. You see that then there's Lay's. Look at number 3, Great Value. Bear in mind, Great Value is a massive brand, a Walmart-owned brand, obviously, across categories. Any of those store brands or owned brands that you see are relative to snacking. So this is their snack, their snack brands, what consumers perceive to be their snack brands and use as their snack brands. So you see there's a range of, across confectionery, chocolate, salty, Various, I think multiple manufacturers represented here. Here's 11 through 20. Again, lots of big brands. You see another really kind of up and comer, Aldi, which has been getting a lot of kind of headlines and press. One thing to note as you look at this is it's not like all the salty is 1 through 10, all the chocolate is 11 through 20, etc. There's a real mashup of various subcategories that you see throughout and across different manufacturers and different retailers. So you see here some of the nuts, and it starts to see more of like the popcorn in some of these lower rankings. I'm going to talk more about this. Here again, you see a good mix. Notice Aplenty and Happy Belly, which are Amazon-owned brands. One that I think fewer marketers are familiar with, but some that are sort of dark horses in the marketplace and are gaining some ground. And then brands like Sour Patch Kids, Members Mark, and then the Target brand's Favorite Day, etc. Oops, skip past that one. And then rounding out the top 50 popcorners and Snack Factory. And just a note, I mean, this is pretty rarefied air. This is not an indictment that Snack Factory is the worst brand. I mean, far from it. It's still, in very good company in terms of certainly the market performance and even the emotional interaction. But you do start to then see how they stack up. One note on this is, as you look to, okay, well, what about our brand? And if you saw your brand in there or didn't, we can certainly go and measure other brands. But if you saw your brand there, you've got to bear in mind that, a brand, let's say Takis being 47, well, that's, remember, a combination of how behaviorally entrained or habituated it is, how attached, how psychologically important, and what the trajectory is. So what we're able to do with this then is drill down and say, well, maybe Takis has a really strong habituation. People that use it are it's a part of every day, but they're not emotionally attached to it. Or they use it every day and they're emotionally attached to it, but they'd like the momentum is going down. There's a diagnostic within each of these rankings that even within the scoring that gets to what is it that's driving it and holding it back among those three really important elements. So, I mean, obviously, I mentioned there's a lot of big brands, but these brands do cover over 50 billion in annual sales. I mentioned 12 categories. This measure that we use, which is essentially a neuroscience and neuropsych workup that these respondents took, is based on over 100 psychological metrics. This is a U.S. rep pop sample, really carefully controlled. You can see some of the demographics in across the bottom there. And another interesting thing to note is if you look at this list by Gen Z, so younger consumers or Gen X, well, it's a different ranking. So that's another thing that, as follow-ons, you look at the generation or some teams are interested even in ruralization, certainly, ethnicity. You do some of these cuts and you can see some differences and you can see some vulnerabilities, you can see some strengths. So just bear in mind that obviously is within these data, and that's something that we're happy to talk about as follow-ons, these double clicks on audience profiling. So just at the category level, and to give you some contextualization, a taste of some of the other things, the top three, so if you kind of close your eyes and picture that list, the top subcategory performers is chocolate, followed by potato chips, followed by cookies. Then the bottom three are meat snacks, nuts and trail mix type products, and then pretzels. Pretzels are challenged in a number of ways. It's not to say that it's gloom and doom, but they're the lowest performing at a category level across the categories. This is a quick look again at the top three and bottom three on momentum. So I mentioned this always garners a lot of interest, particularly from like Wall Street analyst types that are like, okay, well, where's it headed? And you can see that the top three, gainers in terms of growth, just to sort of curate this chart a little bit. What the top one means is for a plenty of users, of current users of a plenty, 50% of them are increasing their consumption, and maybe 5% are decreasing. So you see the top three actually are owned brands, and I don't think that's a huge surprise. But in a minute, I'm gonna explain something about why they're growing. That's not what everybody thinks, and not what the headlines are indicating. And in short, what everyone thinks is because people are trading down. Now, everybody's trading down because of inflationary pricing. Inflationary pricing matters, but again, I'll show you in a moment something far more interesting about why some of these owned brands are performing. So those are on the uptick, and then you see Twizzlers, Chex Mix, and Quaker Chewy as the laggards. But just again, a note, I mean, they're not circling the drain. It's not like they're an inverse to the top three and it's all red. You know, in fact, I think in all three cases, there's a higher percentage of their current users that are that are increasing. It's just not as dramatically as the others. So you know, they're not, their momentum is not as strong as those top three are. Okay, this is a kind of an unusual chart. We call this the neighborhooding chart. So Brian mentioned that we measure and track the durable drivers and barriers of behavior. So these are the 4 drivers of any behavior, and today we're talking about snacking. So when someone's choosing a snack, these are the 4 mental lenses. These are the 4 decision criteria that enter into their mind. And one of them will most strongly, most directly drive their actual behavior. And so the way to read this chart is I'm gonna talk more about these four wedges, these 4 neighborhoods as we call them. But you see that black dotted line, that's a 100 index. So everything above that is an over index, and you can see there's 5, 10, 15, 20, and then these lines that come out. So that gives you some level, degree of over-indexing with this driver. And so just to walk through this, in terms of snacks that are performing because among their users, they're perceived to provide practical options that make rational sense. Those top 3 are Snack Factory, Nutri-Grain, and Skinny Pop. So, there's interesting things as you dig in, depending on which brand you look after. Snack Factory was the number 50 on the list, and it's the top over-indexing on a practical option that makes rational sense. That's not a bad place to be. I mean, I will say the rational space is typically not the most fertile ground in snacking. It's interesting because it's, a lot of teams talk about the say-do gap. Everyone says, I want healthier. Everyone says this is what they want. Practical options that make rational sense. And again, not to indict the brands that are over-indexing in there, but it's not necessarily where some of the top performers are residing either. So experiential is all about sensory discoveries and experiences. You see brands like Cape Cod, Starburst, and Sour Patch Kids in there. The tribal one, this is all about social connection and agreement. And this is one that I've been very interested in as we've looked at this, because look what's in there. Lay's, that's not terribly surprising. And when we see mega brands like I think a $4 billion brand like Lay's, they are tribally endorsed. Coca-Cola is typically, no one's going to be mad at you for bringing it to a party. No one's going to be mad that you brought Lay's. They've got a high degree of social connection and agreement. What's interesting though is the store brands. So Aldi and Great Value happen to be higher indexing even than Lay's in this space. And what that tells us, and what we continue to see and talk about in our data, is that private label or store brands or owned brands are not a trade down. It's not merely, I want the same thing cheaper, so I'm making a rational decision. I wouldn't have anticipated, but I think many would have hypothesized that all the store brands would be over in the rational. I'm going to make a rational choice and trade down to save some money. That's not what it is. Those brands have become tribally endorsed among those shoppers. And the so what, if you're a manufacturer, is that gives you a lot of avenues to compete beyond just price. So in other words, many teams are in this conundrum of the race to the bottom, saying, oh, we're interacting, let's just imagine your brand is losing volume to great value in your category. Many teams look at it and go, oh man, time to go on deal, time to promote, time to try to compete. And we've seen case after case where even line priced, they still then weren't winning. They still weren't reversing declines. That's because they weren't creating tribal endorsements. So in that case, your promotions should be much more about, tribal benefits. Because you're a shopper here, you get this benefit or this opportunity from a promotional standpoint. It gives a lot of avenues. So you could argue it both ways. You could argue if you're in charge of the Aldi portfolio, it gives you some great insight. If you're losing volume to Aldi, it tells you why, and it's a why that isn't just the obvious of price trade down. So I know I took a minute on that tribal piece, but on the store brand thing, I'm just very passionate that it's still a huge misconception and myth out in the marketplace that it's just about dollar trade down. We continually see in our data that it's not. And then the last one, and this is kind of another big assumption in snacking. Everybody assumes this is what it's all about, and it is important. Fueling feel good, more impulsive purchase. And interesting, you see brands like the meat snack brands over-indexing on that. Sour Patch being out there too, which isn't terribly surprising. And look, some of the the mainline like salty brands, the Cheetos, Doritos of the world are going to be in that space as well. But it's interesting when you look at the top three. They're nichier, and the ones that really stand out in serving that need. So this is a recap of what I just played. So just to kind of reiterate, the top three in terms of feel-good impulse purchase, the top three in terms of social connection and agreement. Again, you heard my soliloquy on the role of owned brands and the opportunities therein. And then new sensory discovery. So, if you're in these brands, and going from memory, I mean, Cape Cod was not, I don't think it was top half in performance. So if you're trying to move Cape Cod up, that's the kind of thing where you look at it and go, all right, what's our innovation pipeline look like? And is it providing new sensory discoveries to explore? That brand, people want that brand to be doing that, for example. And then the practical rational I talked about. These make sense. It's what I think in a lot of cases would be called like wholesome snacking, things like that. Again, it's not an indictment on them, but it might be the kind of thing where they say, okay, we've got some equity there. How can we leverage that and elevate? We don't want to be just the safe choice, because that often then you'll find is not as strongly correlated with some of the emotional metrics that we see. So I talked about the durable drivers and barriers. I just spent some time talking about the 4 drivers. If you imagine that slide with those 4 neighborhoods, that's the top half of then what this is the bottom half of, which is this full, what we call a compass. This is the 5 barriers. And again, if you ask consumers, especially with all the headlines, all the hype and hysteria about inflationary pricing, why don't you do things? What hinders you? They always, for the most part, say the same thing: price. And when we're measuring price, we're not just measuring, is it cheap? We're measuring, is it a good value for the money? That's really what people are evaluating. And I don't mean to diminish that and say, no, inflationary pricing is a myth, or, it's all just hype. It's not. I mean, it's real, and it's spending power and some of those things, particularly when you look at various demographics of, household income and things. Yes, it matters, but it's not all that matters. And in many cases, it doesn't matter at all, or at least nearly as much as anyone believes. And so, yes, you see over in price the brands that need to keep their eye on that. It's not terribly surprising. I mean, they're high price point, expensive products, meat, snacks, nuts, things like that. You look at time, what will I have to give up doing? And you see some of these owned brands at smaller manufacturers. You kind of have to go out of your way to buy these snacks. There are certainly shoppers that do all their, perimeter and center grocery shopping at Aldi, and Aldi has a very loyal base of shoppers. But if you're trying to just find this, for these snack brands, and likewise with the Amazon brands, it may be, it's not necessarily something you can get, obviously, at Kroger or Walmart, where a larger percentage of people are going to be doing their grocery, the primary grocery shopping. The social barrier, what will other people think of me? I mentioned the whole, nobody ever raised their eyebrows because somebody brought Lay's to a party. The brands that are most vulnerable to that sort of reaction, a shopper or a consumer saying, is this tribally endorsed? Do people like me like this? Will my household like it? Great value. Popcorners, which is a newer Frito-Lay brand, and then Target's favorite day. Physical, again, this is the one that a lot of people talk about as well when it comes to snacking. How bad will this make me feel? Physical consequences, and you see that there are, you have to dig into like where you interact with the Aplenty portfolio, but it's got some serious concerns with that. And then Snickers and Dots pretzels, and then the emotional barrier. And this is one that overall, when we measure, why. So, for example, why are people still buying so many carbonated soft drinks when pricing is up 17%? Looking at another category, why are people doing things? Why has McDonald's had the best quarter in company history earlier this year? Why are people still doing things even though price elasticity models indicate they wouldn't? And it's certainly true in the snacking space as well. Everybody's not selling all these snacks on deal. There are strong margins being had. The reason is because it's, as I said a minute ago, it's not just about the price. It's about, will I be emotionally satisfied? Will this provide this relief and this enjoyment and this break from the day, depending on where on those 4 drivers you are? Will it do that? And you see that then the brands that are most susceptible to a fear of disappointment are like Airheads, which is a nichier brand, nichier confection brand, but still a big one. Kirkland, what that indicates is that Kirkland, when it comes to snacks, there's more of a fear of disappointment. And if you start to get into the diagnostics of these, and this is a little editorial, but they don't have Kirkland doesn't have a huge snack portfolio. It may be more things like a thing of cashews this big that's $36. You can see where the fear of disappointment, there's some correlation to that. So again, it's not an indictment of Kirkland relative to snacks. I mean, that's a power brand. It's not saying that in snacks it's struggling, but it is something that that does pop up. And then Oreo, there's a component of this emotional one that's not just fear of disappointment, it's overload. So when somebody's just looking for something, for the simple enjoyment, and if you think about Oreo's innovation strategy over the past few years, there's been a lot of SKU proliferation. I mean, there are a lot of Oreos to choose from. And we think that's part of what's going on here, is that it's like, look, I just want an Oreo. You're making me think too hard about all these slight variations in SKUs, and that's creating an emotional barrier. So it gives you just a taste for then how we're going about measuring, what's driving, what's hindering a certain brand, and therefore why is their habituation, psychological attachment, and trajectory looking the way it is, and what can the teams do about that? For whom? How can they move that forward? So with that, I mentioned that we can dip into this data set where teams are seeing a good opportunity is to engage with us and say, okay, look, what about our brand? And so the way we're setting this up typically is saying, all right, you can choose, as many brands as you like. Typically, you need to have at least 3, whether it's all yours or yours and competitors. And we can really dive into some of those things that I voiced over around audience profiling. Who are your heavy, medium, and lights? Like, who's really into you? Who's kind of in the middle, but highly incremental, and who's not worth going after? How does that size out in the market? How do the demographics line up? I mentioned that if you do this list by Gen Z, everything jumps around. And then what are the diagnostics around habituation, attachment, and trajectory that are driving and hindering your brand and competitors? And then on that neighborhooding chart that I showed, where do you and your key competitors sit? Who do consumers think you're replacing? I mean, cheese flavored snacks, Goldfish and Cheez-It and Cheetos, think that that's their kind of competitive set, and certainly there's some reality to that. A lot of times that's not the case. The psychological job of the brand might be something 3 aisles over that you're competing with. So that neighborhooding, what are you competing with in their minds in terms of those psychological drivers and barriers? That's important. And then we're able to get into some of the heuristics. What are then the opportunities? How can you then activate that out in the marketplace? I gave that example of promotions that, look, don't save them money, provide tribal endorsement. That's a good example at a high level of an implication that it's like, okay, now we've got a whole new avenue to compete with store brands that has nothing to do with price, and in fact will be more impactful in driving behavior. And that's certainly something that we're happy to talk about as well. And then, of course, here's the email where you're welcome to reach out to us and make those inquiries. And it looks like there's been a lot of activity. I can't walk and chew gum very well, so I've been trying not to look over. But Chris or Brian, if you want to recap kind of what's been going on over in the thread, I'm happy to have some discussion.
All right, excellent. Well, first, thank you for the presentation, Hunter. Really, really insightful. We did get some questions coming in. So I know you talked about this a little bit, but it's a little bit of a change from just a look at the private label. Would you be able to share some of your advice for teams that are concerned about trade down to private label if they're on the, manufacturer side there?
Yeah, I mean, I probably already have kind of given this example, but it bears repeating. Don't fall into the myth or misperception that it's all about price. And this whole trade down, I think, should become a 4-letter word in insights and marketing circles. Don't look at this as a trade down, because the second you say that, then it creates all these conventions, all these assumptions that somebody is going, I can't afford the good one, so I'll be, I'll trade down. That's not the case. You look at a brand like some of the owned brands, and it wasn't on this list, but like Simple Truth. Those are power brands. People have strong emotional attachment to them. We see that in a lot of these data. An Aldi owned brand, people aren't like, I'm not rich enough to shop at Kroger, so I guess I'll go to Aldi. They're strongly emotionally attached to a brand like that. I mean, look at Trader Joe's. There was just a poll that one of my teammates was pointing out to me that, and I can't even begin to cite it, but she was pointing out that one of the highest passion brands was Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's is not expensive, but people aren't going there because it's cheap. People are not, people don't have the tribal loyalty to that concept because of the pricing. And so there's all these anecdotes out in the world that demonstrate that. But, if you're worried about store brands, walking out of this presentation, at least look at that tribal insight that we gave. And secondarily, sort of banish this idea of trade down and really seek to diagnose why is that people may be switching. That's very likely much more emotional, or at least has an emotional component you could leverage beyond just the line price considerations.
We have another question asking, how do the three components of the composite score you described relate to each other? Is there a fluid dynamic there? Are they all kind of in their own silo? How do they connect to each other?
Yeah, we do see correlations. And of course, our neuroscience team loves to, we have a pretty robust algorithm that processes all of these. And we do see some correlations, that behavior and emotion. So that habituation, when it becomes an important part of your life, that does tend to correlate with emotional attachment. Sometimes there's a reverse correlation then with momentum, and that's why it's really hard to grow huge brands, because if it's habituated, and there's lots of people for whom it's habituated and they're attached, it's hard to drive a lot of growth and momentum. So we do see some of that, but typically, the magic, and this is probably not big news, is we've been, for my 20 plus year career, people are going, how do we habituate the behavior and how do we create more emotional relevance? Those aren't new ideas, but how to do it, and those drivers and barriers that are the avenues to that, that's where you can drive those. And typically when you've driven entrainment or habituation and emotional attachment, you've got a really strong brand. And whether the momentum is really strong or, as I said, lower than others, that tends to be less important than the more emotional components.
And you just mentioned neuroscience there, and I was hoping for a layperson like me, you could explain how you measure this a bit further. You mentioned that all that is based in neuroscience. Exactly what does that mean?
Yeah. And there's, a lot of people hear neuroscience and, out in the marketplace. To me, there's kind of a continuum. One end of the continuum is where a lot of the stuff is. eye tracking, copy testing, even some of the things that like Siggy and his teammates did back in their lab days of putting EEG, like shower caps on people and measuring that. Yes, that absolutely is out there. We're using, and what we've created and have developed is this neurodiagnostic digital study. So, thousands of people go on, they take this study of these repeated measures. They're very unique measures. They appear on, I'm going like this, they appear on a screen, and they're reacting to these stimuli. And essentially what it's revealing to us, once it's processed through our back end, our algorithms, is psych perception, that I've been describing. And then going back to about 2018, we built this database. So we're able to normalize and tap into that database to create some of the indexes and things that I shared today. And, I get, Chris, your point about layperson. I mean, I'm obviously not, steeped in the more technical aspects of it. There's a really good video on our website where Siggy goes through and explains it. And for anybody that really wants to peel back the onion, we're always happy to talk further.
Perfect. And I'm wondering too, you have this platform, you're reaching out to all these consumers. Do they rate every single brand regardless of their usage? Is it only for people that have some kind of strong, connection to the brand one way or the other? How does that work?
They don't have to. No, not everybody takes it. They don't have to have they don't have to be like zealots for the brand, but they have to have enough, what the team calls salience usage. They have to be at least occasional users of it, because what we don't want is people sort of when they go through, and it's called tagging, when they go through and associate these brands with those neighborhoods that I described. We want them to have enough awareness of it that they can give us an accurate read. So it's at least occasional users of a given brand that go through and do the correlations with a given brand.
So we have a couple of questions taking a look at rational, tribal, and those other categories you put together. So the first one we have coming in is wondering whether or not physical is only for negative outcomes. It says how it will negatively impact them. Is that also that physical aspect something that could help them in the case of a better for you brand?
Is physical only negative? So the reverse corollary of the physical barrier, the physical cost, typically they're not antithetical to each other, but typically would be the rational. It makes rational, practical sense. It's got protein and low X that I know will make me feel better. So there is kind of a driver corollary to that. There's also, however, so imagine you're looking after one of these brands and you've heard people say, I just don't like the way it makes me feel, or I worry about how it makes me feel. It could be very rational, like I just described. Another of the drivers is very experiential, though. And it could be that they're really, when they say that, they mean it's all about my senses, it's all about my experience. And that's the kind of situation where teams can spin their wheels an awful lot to say, low fat, low carbs, low this, low, claims, very rational. And it never addresses what someone's really concerned about. So there is a driver side of, better for you, make you feel better. We did an article the other day and cited a brand like RX Bar, as an example of that. The physical cost side there, as the antithesis of this, that as I described it here today, is the purely negative. And it's not to say that like people hate that brand because it makes them feel terrible. It's to say that when someone's reaching for that brand, for example, when someone's reaching for one of these, that's what crosses their mind. So it's not to say that like no one's going to eat a Plenty because they think it'll make them feel bad. It's that if you're trying to sell a Plenty, you want to reassure of that and shorten that stick, because that's the thing that's most likely to trip you up.
And we have one question about the extent of how rational and tribal depend on the shopper and not just the product. The example they bring up is Skinny Pop could be seen as tribal for, health conscious consumer sets. So I was wondering if you can give us any insight there.
Absolutely. It's all about the people. And what we're doing, there's kind of two pieces to that answer. One is absolutely two people could walk up to Skinny Pop and have totally different profiles in their brain. They could look demographically identical. They could both be the same shopper, same income, same ethnicity, all that kind of stuff. But what's going on in their brain One could be totally rational and looking at claims and going, okay, they'd be looking at more verbal information and claims and saying, oh, okay, I see that, there's only 50 calories per serving and no saturated fat and made with real, cheddar cheese and things like that. The other shop, and they might pick it up. The other shopper that walks away might be going, it's an interesting challenge, but their brain might be saying, do people like me agree that this is, the right snack to be consuming? And if the brand doesn't do a sufficient job of reassuring that, they might pass along and pick up another popcorn brand, another or a whole other category. So it absolutely varies by people, and at the broadest level, that's what we're doing. Everything I've shown today is at the Gen Pop level. But as I said, if you looked at like Gen Z or people that prefer shopping in a certain place, etc., you'll see that these profiles can shift because context is super important in someone's decision making.
So we have a few more questions here. I do want to remind the audience, we do have about 20 minutes here. So if there's anything else you'd like to ask of Hunter, make sure you throw it in the Q&A chat. This question is somewhat similar, but Gina's asking about the experiential measure. She's wondering if it only includes respondent perception. She's saying the measure could be largely affected by differences within a brand product in variety, including new flavors, et cetera. So is that only from respondent perception? Is there some other metric that you include in that section?
This is respondent perception. Just a reminder that we often say, or I guess I should say the scientists often say that traditional market research is what people think they think. This is their true subconscious perception, but it's an excellent point that a given brand, and I think I even kind of gave the example of Cape Cod. Yes, the brand may be looking, people are looking at that brand as serving that unique sensory discoveries to explore. Again, not to armchair quarterback on behalf of Cape Cod, but if there were something we found in the data that other salty brands or other chip brands were more in that instinctual feel-good space, you'd absolutely want to innovate into that space in order to be the most complementary. So this is not necessarily meant to say, so position this brand in this way. When you get in, especially brands of these size, where there can be variants that are huge brands in and of themselves, whether a sub-brand or just a variant, absolutely you can push into that. But what we find, innovation's a good example. What we find is everybody gets stuck in that purple. It's bells and whistles and new flavors and flavor trends and new experiences. And that may be all right, but it may not be the most incremental. So understanding which other, as we call them, neighborhoods you can reside in, you can set up property within, and how to do that can be a really incremental and very deliberate way of thinking about your innovation strategy in a case like that.
I think this is a good question that kind of ties all of these other questions together. But Amanda asks, can you speak to the seemingly contradictory compass for great value? She says it over-indexes in tribal motivation, but also in social barriers. So she's wondering, is it helped and hindered by social dynamics?
It is. And that's one of those, I think that's a really interesting one too, that, it's provides social connection and endorsement. And I think that's why then, because of that importance, and that's one where people always misperceive that they're directly correlated. It's the easiest one to do that. They're both green here, and there's some reasons for that, but it's driven by that and hindered by that. That's not always the case, but that's exactly what it says is great value. That's really what's driving it. But when someone encounters it at the shelf, for example, that's also what's most passing through their mind of, is everybody going to like this? So yes, it's driving and hindering it. We see cases as well where somebody, great value is all about tribal, and then there's a physical cost. People say everybody likes this, but do I really want to give this? Is this really going to be good for everybody? So yeah, that is the case with great value. They haven't cemented it. Again, it's not to say that it won't get bought, but it's to say, the carrot there's the carrot and the stick. The carrot is, everybody's endorsed this and will enjoy it. The stick is the same thing, or will they? And so then if you're running that brand, you want to address that accordingly.
And question I have for you, Hunter, is just taking a look at this research, some other research I've seen emerging on, consumer motivations. Do you find that they have kind of fluid reasons for buying these purchases? Are they consistent in picking out these categories and their loyalty? How do you see that? Is it something that changes rapidly, changes slowly? People are loyal to these products. How does that play out in your mind?
Context is some you see sometimes like on the LinkedIn circles. Context is king or queen. Context matters. So, and what I mean by that is, think about yourself in your life when you're at work versus like when you're at home with maybe your family or your kids or with friends, or when you're on a weekend like with your college friends. You're not a different person, but there are three different contexts, and what drives and hinders your behavior will vary dramatically. You don't make decisions the same way. Same way, even with snacks. You may be in one aisle and it's all about what's in this for us. Is this tribally endorsed? And think about your own shopping. Will everybody like this? You may be in another section or even the same set and go, now, which one do I want? Which one fuels that feel-good impulse that's all about me? I'm going to hide it in the back of the pantry because this is mine. Those mental contexts drive dramatically different purchase behaviors, and it's the same person often in the same 3-second interval making two different decisions. It's really important to understand which one's impacting your category even for that same shopper.
This works as a nice follow-up question for that. Rika asks, what would you say is a common factor or driver for those loyal customers as they start to explore new products and try different snacks, when they risk their habitual patterns? Is there anything that you guys see in your research that would have some kind of common factor or driver that kind of pushes a consumer out of their normal lane?
Yes, and a lot of it depends on how you activate. So if somebody is over on the more rational side, or I should say if your business is over on this more rational side, typically that's more of a mission shop, meaning they've made their decision well ahead of shopping and they're on a mission to go get it. So if you're trying to get somebody with that mindset towards snacking, you've got to show up. A lot of people talk about this within, the old kind of cliche of journey mapping. You've got to you've got to intervene on that and show that you make more rational, practical sense. And there are some very tangible ways to do that well ahead of shopping. Whereas if somebody's making decisions about your category over in this instinctual, they're, as we call it, they're gettable all the way through the moment, the till, the register. I always make the joke that when you see a box of cereal 4 aisles over, it's like that's one of these more instinctual shoppers that's just constantly, in play making decisions. You'd want to intervene with them in a very different way with a much more sensory set of tools right at the moment of truth, right at the moment of purchase. So if you're trying to disrupt behavior or you're trying to prevent it from being disrupted, these profiles tell us a lot about when they're gettable, when their decision making is in play and when it's not, and therefore where to deploy your resources and what to say to them, what to put in front of them in order to actually drive behavior.
So now that we have all of these insights, some of these clarifying questions, I guess one of the more applicable ones, Hunter, would be, how can you apply this type of insight to your business? What's the best way to take this information and kind of inform some of the decision making you would be making if you're working at one of these CPG companies?
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully people have taken some things away, today, and with some of these exemplar brands. And again, you've heard my passion around the whole store brand piece. That's the most obvious is what is it that you see in your more traditional data, your scanner type data. What are problems? What are challenges? Or what are the questions that you have? And then applying some of this to say, well, what are you competing with and what's driving and hindering that, so that again, what to say to who against what out in the real world to drive behavior. Of course, I want everyone to call us, and as I said, we've got this pretty well set up where we can, what brands are finding value with is to say, look, we want these 5 brands, and we want to do a full workup on them. Which is like 3 of our brands and 2 competitors. And that's where we get really deep into a lot of what I've described. That's where then we've got what we need to say, here's your biggest headwind, here's your biggest tailwind, here's your route out of this. I gave that example of if you're really struggling with private label and it lined up with what I described, we'd say your route out is much more social, tribal promotions. And here are like the makings of that. Here's how you'd brief your agency to go do that, like out in the real world. So my unapologetically enterprising answer is call us, and we'll show you how we scope out these in-depth workups, and we'll provide you that playbook. Short of that, use these and look, if nothing else, look to these neighborhoods and create some correlations of your own to say, I think that's where we sit. And it can at least help you open the aperture of how you're looking at a given challenge on the business, for example.
And I guess the last question is, I know we took a lot at, or look today, really at snacks, CPG makers. Is this type of research and study also applicable to food service, food retail, other parts of the food industry? And if so, how?
Ask it one more time. I'm sorry. You
Not a
cut
problem.
off just one sec, Chris.
So basically, we took a look at a bunch of snacks and CPG makers today. I'm wondering if this type of study is also applicable to the food service and food retail industries, and if so, in what ways?
Yes, absolutely. And Brian alluded to that a moment ago. This is a platform that we're really excited about, and we're going to continue to invest in and share. So, looking at away from home, or QSR, or fast casual restaurants, looking at retail, anything, if you will. We're currently just out of field on a similar study on beverage, non-alcohol beverage. Anything can be measured in this way. And in this food and bev space, we see a huge potential for it, and that's exactly what Brian was alluding to. That this is the first foray of it, and we're really excited by what we found and what it's informing. We're really looking forward to widening this across kind of all aspects of food and beverage marketing. So that's the stay tuned part he mentioned.
Excellent. So looking through the Q&A tab, it looks like we got through just about all of the questions. So I think that's going to bring us to the end of today's presentation. Once again, Hunter, I want to thank you for the presentation, and also spending, 20, 30 minutes with us here, going over all these questions, really illuminated a lot. I really like to thank the Alpha Diver team for making this event possible. Please keep an eye on your inbox for a recording of this webinar in the coming days. We will probably send that out on Thursday, John. I see you just added that. So yeah, keep an eye on your email. You will get the slides and a recording there. And also make sure you keep an eye out for next Thursday at 2 p.m. We'll be doing our Food Inflation Outlook webinar. But other than that, have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Hunter.
Cheers.